Robert Frost, work, style and critical response. In 2003, the critic Charles McGrath noted that critical views on Frost's poetry have changed over the years, as has his public image. In an article called The Vicissitudes of Literary Reputation, McGrath wrote, "Robert Frost, at the time of his death in 1963, was generally considered to be a New England folkie." In 1977, the third volume of Lawrence Thompson's biography suggested that Frost was a much nastier piece of work than anyone had imagined. A few years later, thanks to the reappraisal of critics like William H. Pritchard and Harold Bloom and of younger poets like Joseph Brodsky, he bounced back again, this time as a bleak and unforgiving modernist. In the Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry, editors Richard Ellman and Robert Auclair compared and contrasted Frost's unique style to the work of the poet Edwin Arlington Robinson, since they both frequently used New England settings for their poems. However, they state that Frost's poetry was less, consciously, literary, and that this was possibly due to the influence of English and Irish writers like Thomas Hardy and W. B. Yeats. They note that Frost's poems show a successful striving for utter colloquialism and always try to remain down to earth, while at the same time using traditional forms despite the trend of American poetry towards free verse, which Frost famously said was like playing tennis without a net. In providing an overview of Frost's style, the Poetry Foundation makes the same point, placing Frost's work at the crossroads of 19th-century American poetry, with regard to his use of traditional forms, and modernism, with his use of idiomatic language and ordinary, everyday subject matter. They also note that Frost believed that the self-imposed restrictions of meter and form was more helpful than harmful because he could focus on the content of his poems instead of concerning himself with creating innovative new verse forms. The classicist Helen H. Bacon has proposed that Frost's deep knowledge of Greek and Roman classics influenced much of his work. Frost's education at Lawrence High School, Dartmouth, and Harvard was based mainly on the classics. As examples, she links imagery and action in Frost's early poems Birches, 1915, and Wild Grapes, 1920, with Euripides' Bacchae. She cites certain motifs, including that of the tree bent down to earth, as evidence of his very attentive reading of Bacchae, almost certainly in Greek. In a later poem, One More Brevity, 1953, Bacon compares the poetic techniques used by Frost to those of Virgil and the Aeneid. She notes that this sampling of the ways Frost drew on the literature and concepts of the Greek and Roman world at every stage of his life indicates how imbued with it he was. Robert Frost, Literary Themes. In contemporary literary criticism, the editors state that Frost's best work explores fundamental questions of existence, depicting with chilling starkness the loneliness of the individual in an indifferent universe. The critic D. K. Whipple focused on this bleakness in Frost's work, stating that in much of his work, particularly in North of Boston, his harshest book, he emphasizes the dark background of life in rural New England, with its degeneration often sinking into total madness. In sharp contrast, the founding publisher and editor of poetry, Harriet Monroe, emphasized the folksy New England persona and characters in Frost's work, writing that perhaps no other poet in our history has put the best of the Yankee spirit into a book so completely. She notes his frequent use of rural settings and farm life, and she likes that in these poems, Frost is most interested in showing the human reaction to nature's processes. She also notes that while Frost's narrative, character-based poems are often satirical, Frost always has a sympathetic humor towards his subjects. Thank you for learning about Robert Frost. Compliments of Wikipedia. What other American literary figures would you like to learn about?